Okay, let's look at Standard 9, Substandard B. Describe. That's what we have to do. President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union as seen in his second inaugural address and the Gettysburg speech, and in his use of emergency powers such as his decision to suspend habeas corpus. So our focus here is on Abraham Lincoln. We've got to look at him, and we're going to focus in on him in just a minute. Abraham Lincoln, we see on a lot of our symbols today in the United States, the $5 bill, the penny, this commemorative coin here. We have the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and where his statue sits in a chair. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about I Have a Dream speech with Martin Luther King Jr. And in 9B, the elements are preservation of the Union, Abraham Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union or save the Union, and the evidence that shows that he wanted to do that. The second inaugural address, the Gettysburg Address, his emergency powers, and suspension of habeas corpus. All these are political interactions and unity. He wants to keep the United States together. Alright, so let's look at this first one here. Describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union. That's what we're going to do in a second. And let's summarize. Let's see. Second inaugural address, Gettysburg speech, use of emergency powers, suspension of habeas corpus. All this basically means this. What we need to do, our purpose here, our goal, is Abraham Lincoln's efforts to save the Union or preserve the United States and keep it together, to keep the South and North together. So here's a visual. Abraham Lincoln, his whole purpose and effort and fight in being in the war and as President of the United States was to keep the United States together. These three things are pieces of evidence that if you were writing an argument in a paper, I suspect under Common Core you might have to write, and I would predict this might be one of the things you have to write on, that Abraham Lincoln, and you can use these three things as your body paragraphs, that he wanted to save and preserve the United States as his major goal as president during the war. The first one, the suspension of habeas corpus, that's his emergency war powers we're going to talk about. He wanted to save the capital of the United States. He knew that if it fell, he and his government would be moving around from place to place, and he couldn't effectively win the war that way. So he's going to suspend habeas corpus. We're going to talk about that. Second piece of evidence is at the Gettysburg Address when he makes a speech there. Basically, when a lot of people wanted to give up and just let the South go, he says, nope, we got to keep fighting. Don't give up. We owe it to the soldiers who died here in the Battle of Gettysburg as we dedicate this cemetery. And then the last piece of evidence is second inaugural address. That's when he was elected president for a second time. And he says, in it, the war's coming to an end. He says, let's not punish the South if we win and the war ends. Let's not punish the South. Let's reunite as a nation and move on. Let's put our country back together and move forward. Let's don't be vindictive toward one another. Let's don't try to punish each other. Let's just move forward in unity. But before we get to all this, let's turn back to 9, our main focus overall. The student would identify key events relating to the causes of the Civil War. In Standard 8 and in the last video we've been going over this. In 9A we went over this. We said those causes were many, and that these are areas where you may be tested on the EOCT and on your unit test. Nat Turner went over the abolitionist, Missouri Compromise, nullification crisis, the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas Nebraska, Dred Scott, John Brown. And then we didn't go over the election of 1860, and that's one we left off. So what I want to do right now before we get to our main focus is let's talk about this election of 1860 and how it led to the Civil War. Like the others, it's going to create north-south tensions when Abraham Lincoln is elected to office in 1860. And there's going to be the South, they had arguments over the ownership of slaves and sectionalism over Abraham Lincoln being elected. So our essential question is, how did Abraham Lincoln's election cause north-south tensions or sectionalism and lead or become a cause of the Civil War? In 1858, 2 years prior to Lincoln being elected as President of the United States, he ran in Illinois. Springfield, Illinois is where Abraham Lincoln is from. He ran in the Senate race in Illinois in 1858 as a Republican, and he's from Springfield. And he ran against the individual who wrote the Kansas Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas. On the Illinois State Capitol building, he gave a speech, and that speech was known as House Divided Speech. And in this speech, he alarmed Southerners and in his other speeches in the debates throughout the state, he alarmed Southerners who are keeping up with these politics that Southerners view him as an anti-slavery person or an abolitionist who is not a friend to slavery or the slave interest. So he gives a speech June 6, 1858, and he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." He's talking about this argument we've been talking about all along, the westward expansion of slavery or the anti-slavery people not wanting it to expand. And he's saying that this house cannot continue to go through these series of events where we're fighting over slavery or not slavery. So the house is divided between these two camps, these two interests, and sooner or later it's going to come to an end. And he was very prophetic here in prophesying the Civil War coming. But a lot of Southerners felt he was an anti-slavery individual. Stephen Douglas is going to win the race and become a senator of Illinois, but Lincoln's arguments in his speech, House Divided Against Itself speech, gains national attention for Lincoln, and he will become president in 1860. He's elected president. Here's an electoral map. He received a lot of the popular vote, and let's look at this chart here. Then the electoral college vote, he had 59% of the electoral college vote. He received 180 electoral college vote. When he wins, southern states begin to secede from the Union. This word secede is important to know. To secede, that's a verb. That's an action. That's something the states started doing. The first one was South Carolina. Basically, they declared their independence, is what they did, and withdrew from the United States. But let's look at secession real quick. Secession, the noun, is withdrawing from an organization, a union, or especially a political entity. Characteristics are to separate from the United States, to withdraw membership in. An example would be South Carolina seceded from the United States on December 20th, 1860, after Lincoln's election. In the 1990s, a more modern one, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, at the end of the Cold War, seceded from the Soviet Union. Non-examples would be West Virginia, that's going to stay in the United States even though Eastern Virginia secedes from the Union along with the southern states. So West Virginia stayed in the Union as a member of the state. So it did not secede. It was not a part of the secession movement. Let's look at this map here. Confederate States of America down here in orange. The first one to secede was South Carolina. Following suit, I've numbered which ones followed behind. If you look, Mississippi over here was 2, Florida 3, Alabama 4, Georgia was number 5, Louisiana number 6, Texas number 7, Virginia and West Virginia split from Virginia as 8, and Arkansas was 9, North Carolina 10, and Tennessee 11. And all these in blue were Union states. These border states in this light color purple here really did not claim the South Party either. They were really kind of neutral, but they stayed within the Union. They did not secede from the Union. These border states, the difference between them and the Union states is that they had slaves, but they were still part of the United States. Okay, so Civil War finally came, and South Carolina seceded December the 20th. Abraham Lincoln wins his election in November 1860. South Carolina secedes December 20th. So we've completed our events or causes of the Civil War, and we can turn to our main focus, which is to describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union. And all these were his efforts, showed that he had an effort to save and preserve the Union here. We went over just a few seconds ago. And we're going to look at these individually. So when you do write, you can write well on this point that he wanted to save the Union as President of the United States. So our essential question is, how did President Abraham Lincoln try to preserve the Union? And then what proof is there that he wanted to preserve or save the Union? And this is, if we were to prove this in argument, we would use each one of these, write an introductory paragraph, and then we would write a main body paragraph on each one of these and then come down and summarize it up. I would argue that you could add Emancipation Proclamation in there. We're going to talk about it in a different substandard. But the Emancipation Proclamation was another way it showed he wanted to save the Union. We'll talk about that when we get there. And I'm going to use this timeline to go through the events of the Civil War. We'll refer back to it. Alright, so describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union. Let's start out with his use of emergency powers, such as his decision to suspend habeas corpus. So let's focus on that and see how that is evidence that he wanted to save and preserve the Union. When we say use of emergency powers, that's equivalent to saying that Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus within the United States. And what does this mean, habeas corpus? And let's look at that. Okay, habeas corpus is Latin for you have the body, or bring forth the body, and it's a legal instrument. A writ of habeas corpus is a legal instrument that requires that a person who's been locked up in jail by the government be brought before a judge or into a court, and there be informed of the charges against him, and have a lawyer and be able to defend himself and to bond out if need be. So this ensures a person can be released from unlawful detention if there's no probable cause he needed to be in detention. So this instrument, writ of habeas corpus, had been around since the Magna Carta of 1215, when the nobles made King John I sign the Magna Carta, saying that he would give them rights to a writ of habeas corpus, this legal instrument, requiring that they be brought before a judge if they're accused of a crime. So let's look at this definition real quick. Definition: a legal paper filed in court demanding a person be brought before a judge or be released from unlawful imprisonment. Characteristics: a paper document, words written on the paper, given to the court or judge, demanding accusers to show evidence and demanding that the inmate be released if they can't show evidence. Example of a suspension of habeas corpus, where habeas corpus had been suspended, was in 1941 when the Japanese did a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. FDR put Japanese Americans into internment camps and suspended their habeas corpus, their right to be brought before a judge. In 2000, after the 9/11 attack in 2001, President George W. Bush suspended habeas corpus for people accused of, or terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists accused of 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States, and placed them in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and prison down there, without them being brought before a judge or being told what they were charged with or the evidence shown. Non-examples are due process rights, of course: right to a preliminary hearing with a judge in the court, right to bail out of jail, right to due process of law. So that's what a writ of habeas corpus is, and this are examples of a suspension of habeas corpus. And so the United States Constitution, when it was written, gave the President of the United States and government certain powers, emergency powers, that in case of war or internal rebellion, and in case of an attack by another nation, that you could suspend habeas corpus, military law, in other words. So the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. So the President can, or the government can, suspend habeas corpus, but only in times of war or cases of rebellion. In this case, the Civil War is a case of rebellion. Alright, so on April 27, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. And he does this because he suspects that there are spies for the Southern government in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. And he has those Southern spies arrested and put in jail and locked away without being brought before a judge or in a court. And he suspends their writ of habeas corpus. And he wanted to make sure that his government himself were not on the run after these spies took over the Capitol, because if they did, he couldn't fight effectively a war, campaigns or conduct war if he was on the run. So to save the United States, to save the Union, he went ahead and used emergency powers of the President to suspend habeas corpus of people suspected of being spies in the Capitol, Southern spies in the Capitol, Washington, D.C. Alright, ordered them all arrested, no trial allowed, could not see the judge. He wanted to preserve the Union. And here's after 9/11, here's a cartoon that would come out called Guantanamo Bay Prison. Habeas corpus is a play on words, showing that they're going to stay in there until they die. Anyway, so with the suspension of habeas corpus, that is evidence that Abraham Lincoln wanted to save or preserve the Union by saving and preserving the Capitol. Alright, the Gettysburg Address is the second piece of evidence. Let's look at this. Describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union as seen in his second inaugural address. We've already we hadn't went over that yet, but highlighted here, Gettysburg speech. And the Gettysburg speech was given November 19th, 1863, and it was given after the Battle of Gettysburg that occurred on July 1st, 1863. And here at the Gettysburg Address, President Abraham Lincoln was dedicating a cemetery for the soldiers who died at Gettysburg. Gettysburg suffered there were a lot of casualties, more casualties at Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg, than any other battle in the Civil War. Lots of casualties. Alright, and the reason why he gave the speech and why some of the speech comes out is there's a change in popular sentiment within the United States. There's over about 170 battles had already taken place before Gettysburg occurred, and some of those were Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Vicksburg. A lot of casualties: 22,700 at Antietam, 18,300 at Fredericksburg, 30,500 at Chancellorsville, and at Vicksburg 4,835. And then Gettysburg was the largest with 46,286 casualties, people wounded or died or hurt in some way. And a lot of the popular sentiment within the United States was to end the war, end the Civil War, and they were thinking, just let them go, let the South go, let them have their country, let's stop fighting, we'll have too many people dying. That was popular sentiment was starting to come about because of all these battles and all these casualties. So the evidence here in the Gettysburg Address, you could argue, was that Abraham Lincoln wanted to save the Union, because in this speech, the Gettysburg Address, he says to everyone with his popular sentiment to keep fighting, don't give up, don't let the South go. We owe it to the dead soldiers who died trying to save our country and keep it alive, keep the Union together. We owe it to them to keep fighting. So this is evidence here that Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve or save the Union. In the Gettysburg Address, he gave it his very short address, Very powerful, one of his most famous speeches that he's known for. And he was dedicating the cemetery in Gettysburg on the side of the Gettysburg battlefield. And in it, he is going to go against this popular sentiment to just let the South go and to end the war. Let's end it. He is going to use a moral or ethical reason why we should continue fighting the war and win it for the Northern War effort. It's a very short speech. He finished it within 2 minutes. So one of the reporters was getting out a pen and pad and thought he had time. By the time he got his pad out, Abraham Lincoln was finished with the address. Powerful affirmation of Lincoln's desire to see the Union reunited. And the only way you're really going to understand this is to read it. And here's some of it. Here we're going to go through it and read it together. And I had to memorize this in middle school. But here it is. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. He's talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, that field where it was fought. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place, the National Cemetery, Gettysburg National Cemetery, for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. In other words, we should dedicate this cemetery to these people that died here in this great battle. Now, if we go to Gettysburg, we find a map here of the United States on Google Images. Gettysburg happened in Pennsylvania, and we can zoom in here on Google Images and we can find where the Gettysburg battlefield was. Here's Gettysburg, Virginia, and there's the Battlefield Museum Cemetery. But there's Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, not Virginia. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So this battle occurred in the north. We're going to talk about that when we go over the battles. So there's Pennsylvania. Alright, that's where Gettysburg took place. Alright, so that's that part of it. Alright, let's go to the next one. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. This is the reason for dedicating the cemetery he's given. Alright, then it says, it is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here have thus far so nobly, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. In other words, he says, us the living, we can't give up. In other words, we have to finish what they started. We have to dedicate ourselves to finishing the work they started. In other words, to reunite the country. That's the work they started, and they're trying to win this war to keep the country alive and keep it together. And it says, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. He's saying we have to continue the fight. Just like they did, we have to continue the fight. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. In other words, let's make their life mean something. Let's don't make them die for nothing. You know, they fought to keep our union together, to save the United States. Let's don't let their death mean nothing at all. Let's give it purpose. In other words, he was trying to appeal to a moral and ethical obligation of the United States and its citizens to continue fighting the war. Don't give in to this impulse of giving up, because a lot of deaths have occurred. But he says, let's continue so all those deaths will mean something. So he's appealing to their moral and ethical views and understandings. And he said, we have an obligation to continue fighting for these men. We can't give up. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. So this is ironic that he's on a cemetery where people are buried, and he's talking about this new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Government shall not perish from the earth. The United States shall not perish. That it will stay together and be united. And that after it's all over with, we're going to experience this new birth of freedom. So we can't give up. We have to live on. We have to fight this war and wage it further. Here's a picture. This one is a painting of Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. Here's a real photograph that was taken there. Here's another one. Here's a zoomed up closer look at the upper picture. That's Abraham Lincoln there. Okay, go back to that. There he is here. That's it zoomed in. Alright, second inaugural address is another piece of evidence that suggests that, or actually shows that, Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union. So, our standard says, describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union as seen in his second inaugural address. So we're looking at his language of the standards. And he gave his second inaugural address after the Battle of Atlanta, after Sherman burnt down Atlanta, made his march to the sea. And we're going to talk about the importance of that battle later. He gave the second inaugural address because he had been just re-elected a second term. Okay, and it is evidence that Abraham Lincoln wanted to save or preserve the Union, and that he said, close to the end of the war, when everyone knew that the North would probably win, he was basically sending out the message: let's not punish the South, let's don't be vindictive, let's just reunite as a nation and let's move on. And we're going to look at some of the language in this that suggests that. That is exactly what he was thinking. And here he is, standing here. This is in Washington, D.C. And he's given his inaugural address for winning his second election. And let's read some of this second inaugural address. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. Impending means we knew it was coming. Okay, it was on the way, sooner or later, because all those events we were talking about. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Nobody wanted it. Henry Clay especially didn't want it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, that's the last one he did, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war. He said his goal, and the North's goal, was to save the Union without going to war. Urgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war. Here he's talking about the spies that were in the Capitol and the reason why he suspended Habeas Corpus. Okay, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. He's talking about the South would make war. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. In other words, he's saying the aggressor, the person who started this war, was the South, not us, the North. And the other the North, would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. In other words, we're here to save the Union, and we had to fight a war to do it. And then this Civil War came. All right, then he says, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. So most of the slaves were in the South. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. In other words, this factions, or this group of people, formed factions around slavery as a party, or as their interest politically. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. In other words, these slave interests, the southern slave interests, were the cause of the Civil War, South. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, in other words, he says slave interest, wanted to spread it westward. That's what he means by strengthen, perpetuate, and extend. the expansion of slavery westward, that question we talked about, caused secessionism, which the insurgents, the southern slave interests, would rend the nation even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than restrict the national enlargement of it. In other words, the United States just wanted to stop it from spreading westward. Alright, both, talking about North and South, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Here's the reference to slavery. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. He's talking about God punishing us for having slaves. Then he says, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those whom the offense came. In other words, God will remove our woes in his own time. He gave us these woes by giving us the Civil War because we had slavery, the offense, which we perpetuated. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Okay, so some biblical and religious references. Alright. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. In other words, he's talking about we hope this war be over with soon. We feel like it is, and they were predicting that the North will win. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It says we must take God's punishment. Notice the references to unrequited toil, the bondsman's 250 years, and the lash here, drawing blood, slavery references. And then in the last part it says, with malice toward none, with charity for all. In other words, let's not punish each other, let's not look for revenge. With firmness in the right, that's the right thing to do. As God gives us to see the right, God wants us to do this, forgive one another, move forward. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. In other words, to care for one another, to reunite the country and heal together. To care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So in this second inaugural address we see four expressions by Abraham Lincoln. He expressed slavery was evil, God was punishing us for it. 2, he expressed the hope for restoring the Union, bringing the United States back together, unity. 3, expressed a sorrow for both sides. And 4, expressed a need to rebuild the nation, not punish the South or the loser. So the second inaugural address, the significance of it is that it was a speech by President Lincoln calling for unity in the United States, to come back together as a nation. Unity was the emphasis. Asked that we not punish the South, the loser, but that we bind up our wounds and heal together. So let's look at these three pieces of evidence. Suspension of habeas corpus. Lincoln attempted to save the Capitol by imprisoning spies in Washington, D.C. by suspending their habeas corpus. Emergency powers of the President. Gettysburg, given after the Battle of Gettysburg, justified the Northern war effort on moral and ethical grounds. We owe it morally and ethically to these dead soldiers to let their life mean something. Don't let them die. Don't give up. Don't let them die in vain. Let's don't give in to this popular sentiment. Let's finish this war. From these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And then the second inaugural address emphasized unity instead of punishing the South, with malice toward none, with charity for all, and to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle for his widow and his orphan. So have we met our objective? Have we talked about how, Abraham Lincoln wanted to save and preserve the Union? Have we met that? And I believe we have. I believe we described Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union in detail. And here are all the pieces of evidence. We find them in the standards. And so with that, watch this video over again, strengthen yourself in the understanding of this, and then in class ask questions. Good luck on the test. Okay, let's look at Standard 9, Substandard B. Describe. That's what we have to do. President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union as seen in his second inaugural address and the Gettysburg speech, and in his use of emergency powers such as his decision to suspend habeas corpus. So our focus here is on Abraham Lincoln. We've got to look at him, and we're going to focus in on him in just a minute. Abraham Lincoln, we see on a lot of our symbols today in the United States, the $5 bill, the penny, this commemorative coin here. We have the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and where his statue sits in a chair. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about I Have a Dream speech with Martin Luther King Jr. Suspend habeas corpus. We're going to talk about that. Second piece of evidence is at the Gettysburg Address when he makes a speech there. Basically, when a lot of people wanted to give up and just let the South go, he says, nope, we got to keep fighting. Don't give up. We owe it to the soldiers who died here in the Battle of Gettysburg as we dedicate this cemetery. And then the last piece of evidence is second inaugural address. That's when he was elected president for a second time. And he says, the war's coming to an end. He says, let's not punish the South if we win and the war ends. Let's not punish the South. Let's reunite as a nation and move on. Let's put our country back together and move forward. Let's don't be vindictive toward one another. Let's don't try to punish each other. Let's just move forward in unity. But before we get to all this, let's turn back to 9, our main focus overall. The student would identify key events relating to the causes of the Civil War in Standard 8, and in the last video we've been going over this. In 9A we went over this. We said those causes were many, and that these are areas where you may be tested on the EOCT and on your unit test. Nat Turner we went over, the abolitionist, Missouri Compromise, nullification crisis, the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas Nebraska, Dred Scott, John Brown's, and then we didn't go over the election of 1860, and that's one we left off. So what I want to do right now before we get to our main focus is let's talk about this election of 1860 and how it led to the Civil War. The South and North together. So here's a visual. Abraham Lincoln, his whole purpose and effort and fight in being in the war and as President of the United States was to keep the United States together. These three things are pieces of evidence that if you were writing an argument in a paper, I suspect under Common Core you might have to write, and I would predict this might be one of the things you have to write on, that Abraham Lincoln, and you can use these three things as your body paragraphs, that he wanted to save and preserve the United States as his major goal as president during the war. The first one, the suspension of habeas corpus, that's his emergency war powers we're going to talk about. He wanted to save the capital of the United States. He knew that if it fell, he and his government would be moving around from place to place, and he couldn't effectively win the war that way. So he's going to in 9B, the elements are preservation of the Union, Abraham Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union or save the Union, and the evidence that shows that he wanted to do that. The second inaugural address, the Gettysburg Address, his emergency powers, and suspension of habeas corpus. All these are political interactions in unity. He wants to keep the United States together. Alright, so let's look at this first one here. Describe President Lincoln's efforts to preserve the Union. That's what we're going to do in a second. And let's summarize. Let's say second inaugural address, Gettysburg speech, use of emergency power, suspension of habeas corpus. All this basically means this. What we need to do, our purpose here, our goal, is Abraham Lincoln's efforts to save the Union or preserve the United States and keep it together, to keep